Drew, I'm so excited for this. I told you beforehand, I listened to your show in 2018 with Tim Ferriss, and I thought, who is this genius? I have to have him on the show. It only took 4 years, but thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, well, thanks, Harry. It's great to be here.
I would love to start today with a little bit of an origin story. So, what was the original unique insight you had with Dropbox? How did you get it, and how did it lead to the founding of the company in a succinct 2 to 3 minutes?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it was kind of as a user, I kept forgetting my thumb drive. I had started another company at the time doing online SAT prep, of all things. But I needed to work from multiple computers. And so I had everything, all of our company's crown jewels were on this little thumb drive that I kept losing or almost putting in the washing machine, all the things that used to happen. And it culminated in this. I was taking this bus ride from Boston to New York to visit my friends, but I wanted to get some work done for my company. And I realized when I got on the bus, I had forgotten my thumb drive. And I wasn't like, oh, I hate my thumb drive. I was like, oh, I hate myself. God, I'm so disorganized. I need to, be more on top of this. But as I thought about it, I'm like, man, I'm just so frustrated with this. This keeps happening. I never want to have this problem again. And I started writing some code, some Python code, on that ride because I didn't have anything else to do. And this was like before you had iPhones and Wi-Fi on buses and things like that. But I had no idea what it would turn into. But it was really just a personal frustration.
I love that. Now, speaking of kind of stories that we have to discuss, I spoke to, kindly thanks to your suggestion, Adam before the show, and he told me that the YC story is the ultimate story of hustle, and that I had to discuss it. So, starting there, what was the YC story that we have to hear?
Sure. Well, Adam Smith was one of my best friends, and we went to college together. And he did Y Combinator, and he moved out to California. He got VC funding, and so all of that. His experience was a big inspiration to me as he was going through all that. So I personally had a very winding road into Y Combinator myself. So I actually applied in 2005 to the first batch with that SAT prep company, Accolade, and was rejected. And then I was still working on it when I had the idea for Dropbox. I was getting a little burned out from the SAT prep thing. I'm like, I don't know how many more equations about parallel lines or the train leaving Memphis and, just like all the things with SAT prep. As passionate about it as you can be, but kind of getting a little burned out, I recognize now. And I was like, hey, this might be a good fit for Y Combinator. So I wanted to apply. That said, one thing that was useful from my whole test prep background was really understanding college admissions. Actually pretty similar, a lot of similarities with something like Y Combinator. You have a lot of people applying for a few slots. So anything you can do to get an edge or a hook would be helpful. So to me, the dean of admissions here was Paul Graham, one of the founders of Y Combinator. And I was sort of working back from like, what does Paul do all day? How do I get in front of my dean of admissions here? And I'm like, I think Paul probably does what most of the rest of us do, which is just keep refreshing Hacker News every day, which is Y Combinator's news site. It's kind of like Reddit for startup news. And I'm like, man, if I can get something on Hacker News, like Paul will see it, this might be good. So I made this demo video that actually hit the top of Hacker News for a couple of days in 2007. And so there's a link it's still out there. You can see I posted this little video, and the response was super good from the community. And sure enough, it actually worked. I got an email from Paul saying, hey, like your idea, but you need a co-founder if you're going to get into YC. And the only problem was I didn't have one, and the interview deadline was a couple weeks away. So it's sort of like saying, I know you're not dating anyone, but you need to be married in the next couple weeks. So I had this kind of crazy kind of musical chairs with some of my friends who were also interested in Y Combinator, just trying to shake the trees to find a co-founder. And as part of that, I had one guy who was interested in partnering with me, but he's like, I want to know what Paul thinks about this. So I decided to drop in unannounced actually show up physically at Y Combinator before one of their dinners. That did not go very well. I was effectively kicked out of, escorted out of the building, which after putting the screencast up there, or I think I might have the order of I think I got kicked out first and then did the demo video. But I had a very good experience with getting in front of Paul and a very bad experience showing up unannounced. And eventually, I talked to enough of my friends, or my friend Kyle Vogt, who ended up starting the company Twitch, and then started Cruise, the self-driving car company. It turned out he also went to MIT. He was floor mates with Arash, and then my co-founder Arash, they were in the same dorm, introduced Arash to me. We hit it off. Maybe we had a couple coffees. Arash and I had a couple coffees, and then decided to throw in together. But there are a couple crazy things about that. Well, so one was Arash was in his senior year at MIT, so he dropped out of school to basically spend all his. We decided like he's going to drop out of school. We're going to basically spend our waking lives together for the foreseeable future. I was expecting to have to like talk to his parents or something, but he just up and left. And we shipped out to California, interviewed, and we got into Y Combinator. But there was this thing after thing that kept happening. On the day we got into Y Combinator, our zip car got broken into, our laptops got stolen. But like our stuff was on Dropbox, so that like on an early version of Dropbox, so we didn't lose anything. But yeah, we had a very kind of strange path into Y Combinator.
Can I ask you on one? We have schedules and then we just go off them, but that's a very
Sure.
loose like relationship pre deciding to found a company and spend your life together with someone. Bluntly, given that and it working so well, how do you advise founders on founder selection? Given so many people say a lot, given your experience, how would you advise founders on choosing?
Well, I don't. Yeah, I mean, our equivalent was like getting married on the second date, which, if you can avoid it, so the good news, we got lucky, so it worked for us. But I think it's much better to, or I think on average, it's probably better to. A lot of the co-founder stories start with like, oh, we played t-ball together as little kids and have known each other since forever. I think if you have that is a bit of a safer bet. I did have friends like that, but they were just busy and doing other things. So, but I think that said, it can still, there's a lot of different co-founder origin stories. I think what the good ones have in common is like any other serious relationship, where I think you need to have a sense of mutual trust and respect, meaning trust as in basic things like integrity, and having a good sense of that. But like, just are you motivated by the same things? Are you trying to accomplish the same things? Do you have the same picture of what you want to do with a company? And then respect. I mean, one thing about any co-founder relationship is you need to have complementarity and overlap on some things. So like for the important kind of existential questions of the company, like what do we want to achieve? How do we want to achieve it? What kind of culture do we want to build? You need to be very aligned. But there's a lot of work, and if you're actually going to get benefit, you need complementarity. So, for example, I really loved everything beyond I love technology. Arash and I both love technology, but I was very interested by the business side too. Arash was more focused. He was more internally focused. You want to make sure our culture was great, that the technology and the quality of the product experience was really good. And so you want to think about where do we really need to overlap and be totally on the same page? And then where can we have some complementarity to divide and conquer? But I think underneath all of that, you need a foundation of trust and respect.
Speaking of the foundations there of kind of a co-founder relationship, I do want to slightly dive on the foundations of like you as a person before we dive into your leadership, which is someone asked me recently, if we're all a function of our history, we're all running away from something and we're all running towards something. What are you running away from and what are you running towards?
Sure. Well, first, I think it's a really important question. The more you can understand what motivates you and bring that from sort of your subconscious to being aware of it is something I wasn't focused on before starting the company. And now I would be very focused on things like that. But I'd say when I'm running away, what I'm running away from or my playbook as an entrepreneur has been to get really personally frustrated by something that's not working the way I think it should and then wanting to fix it permanently. Maybe that's not the most like motivational way to get after some of these problems.
Is that so? Like for me, my father would always tell me that we lived in one part of London, and he always would say, "When we live in that part of London, Chelsea, when you do that, you're a better person." And I always looked at it and I was like, wow, like we need to live there. And that's what I'm like running towards
Sure,
almost, yes.
sure,
Do you see what
sure.
I mean?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, and certainly, like especially early on, I had the same motive. Like, I want to be success, or I don't want to be. I mean, even back to childhood, my parents were like, "You need to reach your potential," and I was like, "Okay, I really got to be ambitious." And so there's some kind of very early wiring and motivation that came from that. But learning to harness the negatives. It's okay to have negative, motivations if you can harness them properly and you're aware of them. So being frustrated by things and wanting to solve problems, turning that into something useful. I'm really competitive. Like, I don't like losing. I don't like the person I become if I'm like playing a board game and not winning. But okay, trying to turn that into something positive. And then, but what motivates me is on the more positive side is I've always been inspired by the power of technology to reshape our lives in both positive and negative ways. And while I think it can cut both ways, and I think like nowadays compared to 10 years ago, I think we're shining a lot more light correctly on some of the unintended consequences of technology and how we can avoid them. When you zoom out, I do think the line goes up. Like the story of like the technological progress and human progress go hand in hand. And I think it's easy to sort of skip past something that's really profound, which is that like, now it is common for like an extremely small number of people to build things, to have an idea, to build something that reaches millions of people. And if you think about it, we're kind of the first generation, maybe, or first generation or two, where that was like even conceivably possible. Like even for my parents, that was like not a thing growing up. You couldn't be like in your dorm room, have an idea, build a thing, have millions of people using it a couple of years later. Like that's what we experienced when we were building Dropbox. Like our team was only maybe 10, 15 people when we were reaching millions of people, millions of customers. So one thing that keeps me motivating is just doing that on a bigger and bigger scale. So having a bigger platform, going after bigger problems, painting on a bigger canvas, trying to kind of like trying to be a force for good at scale, and like really solving more, like reaching more people and doing more for them.
I remember we hit 1 million plays per show and I didn't have an editor. And I was like, that's quite cool. There's no one else. I was like sitting in my
Right?
bedroom
Yeah.
with mum
Like
downstairs.
every Starbucks I go into, like I will look over your shoulder on your laptop and I'll try to see if there's a Dropbox icon there, and I never get tired of seeing that. Or people are like, "Oh, you must be really tired of talking about Dropbox." I'm like, "No, I can definitely talk about Dropbox a lot more for a lot longer than anyone else." But like,
I
really,
want
I think it's really important to know what your motivations are, and I think that changes over time.
I want to talk about your leadership. I think about high performance a lot in sport, but also in business and leadership. When I say high performance to you, how do you define it and what does it mean to you?
Yeah, so I'm kind of I come from like the Andy Grove school, and he has a great book, High Output Management. He was the former CEO of Intel, or one of the founding team in Intel, became the CEO, started as an engineer, learned the business side along the way, big inspiration for me. And one of the tenets of his management philosophy is a manager's performance cannot be rated higher than the output of their organization. So I think you start with, all right, do you deliver results, right? You start with the outputs for whatever you're doing. And so in sports, that might be the stopwatch or the scoreboard. It's pretty hard to argue that you're like a great, sprinter if the stopwatch doesn't agree with you, or that you're a winning, or that you're a great team if the scoreboard doesn't agree. So I think you start with the outputs, and that's the most important thing. That said, there are plenty of cases where or one issue is you don't really, in most of these efforts, you don't actually control the outputs directly, right? You don't, when you're like, I want to win the football game, it's not like you're like setting the score, right? You can only control the inputs.
It also
So
doesn't take account of resulting, which is Annie Duke's theory, which is like you can get the right outcome with the wrong process.
exactly. Yep. So there's sort of false positive, false negatives in terms of like taking the right activities and having the right outcomes. So, but in sports, that the inputs might be something like your level of fitness or your diet or like how much you practice. Like you can totally control those things. In a company, that might be okay. What are your systems, or your people, your metrics, your processes? So I start with results. Are we delivering the results or not? And then I'm like, okay, peel back one layer of the onion. Okay, how's the process? And then the third thing to me is mindset. This is something I didn't pay a lot of attention to early, pay a lot of attention to now, which is like self-awareness, humility, curiosity, as opposed to being defensive or dismissive or blaming external factors, which is like, are you coachable basically? And the reason that matters is because if when things aren't going, when the results aren't good or the process isn't good, or you're not performing well, it's easy there's always some external factors that are easy to blame. But but then you can let yourself off the hook. So if you don't even think there's a problem, you're not trying to do anything differently, your performance is not going to improve. And so mindset is really important, but it's our results, then process, then mindset for me.
You said there about kind of mindset changing. I often find mindsets change often actually in quite a catalytic way, which is like a certain event causes it to change. Like when I'm an investor also, when I lost a company, my mindset changed quite significantly. If you look back on your timeline, is there
Sure.
one or two catalytic moments which cause your mindset to change?
Yeah, yeah. A couple come to mind. So one was my first experience with executive coaching, which I highly recommend. It started off kind of pretty, standard issue coaching experience. You do a 360 with your team. You sit down, you get a little presentation of, it starts with like, all right, Drew, have a seat. Page one, here are your strengths. You're creative, you like new ideas, you like people and relationships. And I'm like, okay, I like this coaching thing so far. Keep going. And then, next page, it's always your development areas, not your weaknesses. But your development areas, your conflict avoidance, you're a bit of a space cadet, and maybe one of your strengths is you're comfortable in chaos, but then you don't actually create structure for your team, which is frustrating for people. The kind of unlock there was when you paired the strengths and weaknesses, they're sort of both sides of the same coin. Like if you like new ideas, then you're bored by routine and not super disciplined about little details. If you love building relationships with people and creating positive vibes, you're conflict avoidant and avoid telling people the truth. So I think the most important, so the catalyst was like really first just awareness of these things instead of them just being kind of you're like sort of buried under the surface and not being aware of them. Like if you're aware of these, like Ben Horowitz gave me he had a quote that I like. He's like, God gave us all weaknesses. It's a blessing to find out about them. So starting with self-awareness is good. And then I'd say the best exercise I've done on this dimension is learning about the Enneagram, which for those not familiar is kind of, you've probably heard of Myers-Briggs or different personality typing systems. I think of the Enneagram as like, as sort of like Myers-Briggs, but useful. So it's similar in that they're, instead of like 4 letters or something, or 16 types in Myers-Briggs, you have these 9 basic Enneagram types, personality types. Doesn't mean that there's only like 9 dots of people. It's more like area codes. You're sort of in this, there are 9 sort of categories or buckets, but they're pretty fixed. Like you start with them from your kind of genetic wiring in your early childhood, but they stay pretty stable over time. And I think the Enneagram is better because I think it has sort of the just right number of types. So some other type or typing systems have like 4 options or things, and 16 is too many. I think 9 is like, once you learn them all, you're like, oh, okay, I know someone in my life who is one of these things. But it's really about what fundamentally motivates you. Like, what are you running from and what are you running towards is actually what the whole theory of it. And like, what's your kind of coping strategy for life that you developed as a kid? So I think from that, I learned I'm an Enneagram 7. And the 7 is, and everybody you get a number between 1 and 9. I'm a 7. 7 is the enthusiast. And I'm like a central casting 7. So 7 enthusiasts, they are broadly creative. They like new ideas. They're curious. They're very positive and optimistic. And part of the reason for all this is they're basically running from pain and discomfort, and they never want to be deprived. So the downsides of that are you avoid discomfort either by like always planning for the future and avoiding the present, or doing like escapist things, or having FOMO all the time, or avoiding conflict. So when I look at like my Enneagram type and I look at my coaching results, it's like totally, I mean, I thought I was a special snowflake. A lot of people do before they do one of these things. Then you take the test, you're like, oh, okay, I'm that. So I think that was a huge catalyst for me.
Can I ask, I'm incredibly conflict avoidant too. What have been some things that have worked for you in trying to mitigate that and trying to combat it?
It's tough. I think first is, I think, well, recognizing it comes from a good place, and often you're trying not to hurt people's feelings, or there are other kind of positive motivations for it. But I think over time, when you withhold feedback from people, you realize that the outcome, or you're actually not helping them. And because they keep making the same mistakes over and over again, or keep having the same patterns, and they don't know about it, and so they don't do anything about it, and then everybody's frustrated. Recognizing that sometimes, and then when you think about your own experience, like, you appreciate it when people tell you stuff that you didn't know, or like you have a thing in your teeth, and so there's sort of this mismatch between what you want to do and what you want others to do for you. And I think just getting first, like, recognizing this is a pattern, it's normal. But then also, I think starting just to experiment with just being more direct and assertive, and then realizing that usually the world doesn't come crashing down, or the person isn't as kind of offended by all this as you think. And then recognizing also, I think there's sort of a superhero complex that can kind of be lurking under the surface here. So often, I would spend so much time trying to like anticipate the other, or I had something that I knew the other person wasn't gonna like. I try to be pretty empathetic, and I'm like, oh man, this is really gonna be painful for them. But then just reaching further and further and further over the boundary to be like, all right, well, now I need to like anticipate their response and like make them feel better about it and all these things. When it's really like, at some point you have to set a boundary, which is like, this is your truth, and they're going to have a reaction to that, to this information. And, you can't really, that's more, their reaction to the truth is more kind of their world and their responsibility. And that doesn't mean like, therefore, to say whatever you want whenever you want it, or don't be empathetic. But for some things that are just gonna be difficult news, one of the quotes I remember from a negotiation class I took is that there's no such thing as a diplomatic hand grenade. Meaning, like, if you're gonna say something and it's gonna explode, like, that's okay. Like, that's normal. You don't have to control or like diffuse every aspect of everything. And I think once you realize that, it takes a lot of, for me at least, it took a lot of weight off my shoulders. And like not having to just trying to get the feedback transmitted and received, more than like trying to land it perfectly or bend myself into a pretzel trying to solve for all of getting the person the feedback and making them still love me forever. And like, you just can't solve for all those things.
I'm using you for advice here. I have this kind of diplomatic hand grenade right now in this situation, and the feedback that they're getting is, just hear me out. Just hear me out. The decision's made. Like, Drew, it's over. Like,
yeah.
Do you hear them out, even though it's futile, just so they feel heard? Or do you say, Drew, it's not going to change anything? Like, the decision has been made.
Well, I think you can do both. I think leading, as I was like a sort of early novice manager, like my first experience trying to fire someone, they ended up coming back to the office the next week and they didn't really get like,
you did a bad job, Drew.
Like, clearly, and then other things where the people are crying, or just like, these are like really traumatic for everyone involved. I mean, more the person receiving it, but also for the person, delivering the message. And I'm like, wow, I'm causing this, whatever I'm doing is like not working very well. So I think first, communicating clearly, like, don't bury the lead, like just saying in the beginning of the meeting, like, hey, this might be a tough conversation. I think it's gonna be a tough conversation. Just like think about how you would want to receive this news is one way to do it. But just like not burying the lead, being direct, being like, yeah, this is not working out, and we're gonna need to talk about a transition or whatever your favorite language is. And then I think, yes, you want to both be direct and definitive, and leave room for them to have their experience and share their story and be diplomatic about it. Hopefully, this isn't like the only conversation you've had about the theme, or hopefully this is. Or I think if the person has like no idea this is coming, then the problem started well before this conversation. Or I think there is some element of due process that it's reasonable for people to expect. But I think, hearing people out is fine, as long as, I find that when you're in these difficult conversations, people often want to then bring it back on you and, and share all the things that you did wrong. And I think that can sometimes muddy the waters, because in a lot of these like business or performance conversations or difficult conversations, it's not like two bad things happening like cancel each other out. In American football, it's like two penalties cancel each other out. It's even. Everybody go back and start the next play. That's not really how it works. So like if someone's not performing or isn't the right fit, the fact that there are things that you could have done better as a manager, I find it healthy to like explicitly separate those conversations, or leave some space between. Like, look, I know there are things I didn't do to help you set you up for success. Like I own that. I gotta be transparent that this doesn't really change the decision, and I'd welcome feedback on what I could have done differently. But like that's not the topic right now. Like let's cover that later if it starts getting kind of in this this back and forth.
Speaking of difficult conversations to have, I often find that the biggest lessons are learned from difficult times. I learned probably one of my biggest investing lessons from losing an investment. When you think back over the journey, what is the most difficult lesson that you learned that you're also super pleased to have learned because of the value that you gained from it?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the toughest moments for me was going through the period of hypergrowth and then having that, and then kind of hitting the peak, and then then things start going the other direction. So for us, we had maybe the 7-year period from 2007 to 2014 where we were just like living the .com dream, numbers, money, everything going up, $1 billion valuations, all that, magazine covers. And then it was also clear that like we were inviting competition from like the best and most capitalized companies in the world, and that Microsoft and Google and Apple and literally everyone was coming after us, cloning our products, bundling them with the operating system or platform, giving everything away for free. And this kind of came to a head when, on the one hand, we were really spreading our wings as a company and expanding in these different areas. When we launched this new this photo sharing app called Carousel, we bought this company called Mailbox, which was like one of the first great kind of mobile email clients. And so like this feeling of like flourishing and going out. But at the same time, it was clear that pretty much everything, we discovered pretty quickly that everything we do is going to be copied very quickly. And that fighting against these mega cap companies is like, it's tough. And moving into the big leagues means you get harder and harder opponents. And this kind of culminated when things like a bunch of things happened, like Google launched Google Photos, which is giving like everybody unlimited storage for globally for life for free. It's like, okay, how are we supposed to compete with that? It's one thing like play a board game with your little brother and like, but then like when they like vaporize this, like they blast the game off the table such that no one can play the game again, you're like, well, this isn't very fun. And then we ended up having to shut down both. I decided to. This was after reading Only the Paranoid Survive by another book by Andy Grove, recognizing this we were kind of in a very precarious. We were at a strategic inflection point that wasn't good for us, where we now have all this competition. And one of the things in the book is, CEOs like to keep their options open and keep doing all these things, but what you really need to do is put all your eggs in one basket and watch that basket, per the Mark Twain quote. And this came after Intel's experience, where we know Intel now is like the processor, microprocessor company, but they were actually started and were known as like a memory company, making like RAM and memory for computers, early computers. And they found that they were just knocking the cover off the ball, doing great, hypergrowth, until just suddenly things weren't working. And they had these Japanese competitors who were like subsidized by the government and who were building things like faster, better, cheaper, and they're just like, we're not going to win. Things look okay right now in all the numbers, but like we are not going to win this game. And they there's this vignette from the book where they are like, well, if we're consultants to ourselves, what would we do? And they're like, we would obviously get out of the memory business and go all in on this sketchy little microprocessor thing. And they're like, well, why don't we just do that? But that sounds easy. And then they did, and they live happily ever after. But that's sort of like Google saying like, hey, let's get out of search, right? So very difficult situation. So we were like, we're fighting this. And what I sort of drew from this is like, Dropbox is fighting all these wars on different fronts. Like we have consumers using Dropbox to share photos, and there we're competing with Apple and Google and Facebook at the time. In productivity, we're competing against a whole other set of people. And then as far as like basic storage, like we're competing with the iPhone to back up your iPhone. Like, how's that going to go? So like really having to take stock of, like really take stock of where we are, and then a very like public, humiliating failure. Like we announce all these things that are the future of the company. A year later, I'm shutting them down. Everybody's like, what the hell is going on? Then the press cycle turned very negative on Dropbox for a while. But so what's the lesson? Like, this, like, as you move, like, this is how it is. Like, as you move up in the big leagues and you make the playoffs, like, your reward every time is a bigger and stronger opponent, and that's in the game. That's like what you're choosing. And then I think what was hard for me personally is that I'm like, what am I doing here? Like, I don't need more money. I've kind of gotten all the merit badges I need for startups, like, valuations or getting this or that investor or milestone. I'm like, is this just making big numbers bigger? Like, what's going on here? And I had to decide, like, what's my motivation? And I was like, it was like very stressful and like not a fun period. And I'm like, our competitive situation is pretty dire right now. So like, what am I even doing? So, I had to go off by myself and kind of really think about that. It really developed a sense of purpose. And actually that year, Andy Grove died. He was he was a hero of mine. I was fortunate. I got a chance to meet him. Bill Campbell, who was a coach to a lot of the Silicon Valley folks and was helpful to me, he died that year. And I really admired how the two of them had really spent a lot of their lives, like, just helping to light the path for those who may follow or help people. And that was really inspirational to me. So I'm like, all right, well, I want to be able to have some kind of, as big as these problems are, they're, at least I have these problems. I hadn't read Andy's book. Maybe I wouldn't even be here. So these are good problems to have. And I just want to why am I doing this? Well, a couple of reasons. One is I want to be able to paint on a bigger canvas, and I believe in the power of technology to make things better. And then second, like, personally, I want it, like, being CEO is a hard job. I'm lucky that, unlike chess or sports or something where you can kind of peak in your 20s or 30s, being CEO is something you can do for, decades and still only be kind of midway through your journey. So I can do this for a long time. So I'm really motivated by the craft of being a great CEO and playing the game better and better. And
My
then
friend,
a lot of them.
you are a spring chicken, I think would be the description.
I'm like 300 years old in Y Combinator founder years, but
you're screwed in that
know.
way. Yeah. But I'm old in that description, and that's really fucking worrying. My question to you is, I know the Clubhouse fan as well. I know the Hopin fan as well. We live in a press cycle where it's brutal. I lost a company earlier this year. Fuck, I got savaged on Twitter.
Yeah.
And I spent the day crying in a corner. So my question to you is, how did you personally handle the cycle which builds you up faster than anything, magazine covers, you name it, and tears you down quicker than anything now? What would you advise me and some of the founders that are going through that?
Well, I think there's nothing anyone can say that will make it that much easier. So just recognizing there's no like Band-Aid. You're like, okay, now I'm better. I feel better. Like, it sucks. It's really embarrassing. My first company, my bootstrap company, like, it never really succeeded, and then it died. But like, then Dropbox was like succeeding massively and then seemed to be dying massively. And I'm like, that is way worse than any of the others. So first, just recognizing that it sucks. Second, I think you need to, as far as how to cope with a lot of the stress and kind of manage your psychology, I think depersonalizing it a little bit and being like, wait, this is not like me specific. This is just like part of the game, or this is how things work. Like the press, it's not personal. They need something that's like the little engine that could, and then at some point they need to tear it down. Like, this is how it always has been and always will be. It's not really about you. And then sort of seeing it and then depersonalizing it more. I mentioned before that, like, I want to play the game really well, but I think that the game part is intentional. This is not like life and death. Like, the more if you sort of internalize, I think it's important to internalize the responsibility you have on your shoulders for people's livelihoods or your customers and things like that. But if it just feels like this like overwhelming burden, like, you won't be able to function and you'll resent the job and you'll burn out. So recognizing that, having a sense of equanimity, like, yes, this is all part of the journey. It's not really about me. This is a game I can get better at. No one's dying. Even you'll always hopefully take your job super seriously. So it's not like don't take things seriously, but just recognizing that this is part of the journey and everyone goes through it. And, look at the big internet companies and the great founders. They all had their periods of kind of being behind the shed and getting whipped. So, you're in good company.
You said about the responsibilities there, especially with teams. I spoke to Sujay before the show, and he said in particular that your ability to build the most incredibly talented teams was something that stood out to him. He asked what were some of your biggest lessons on talent acquisition, and also what are some of the biggest mistakes you made on hiring?
Sure. Well, I think the first thing on talent is just really caring about it, which sounds kind of obvious, but we had a great early investor and advisor, Hadi Partovi, who was also an early investor in Facebook and started a bunch of companies, really experienced and successful and generous with his time with us. So Hadi told us, he's like, well, we were asking, we're like, hey, Hadi, give us advice on how do we build a great company? And he's like, yeah, I asked my mentors the same question. And he's like, my mentor told me, there are 10 things that you need to do as an entrepreneur. Hire the best people, hire those people. And I'm like, okay, Adi, yep, got it. But just like drilling into our heads the importance of recruiting, especially early on. Really, so we internalize, and then there's like really caring about how do you recruit the best people, how do you build all stages of how do you sell how do you get candidates excited, source them. Really caring about the craft of all of that was something that Arash and I became pretty obsessed with. In pretty direct response to Hadi's feedback. And then recognizing that, your company is, whatever your company is or startup is right now is sort of the seed crystal for the company it will become. Okay, what does that mean? Well, people don't usually want to join companies where the people are like less talented than them, right? So talent density is really important, or keeping that seed crystal as pure and good as possible is really important. So because any impurities will grow, or the talent density will only degrade. So in the beginning, that was like handpicking this for Arash and me. It was really just like handpicking the smartest people we knew from MIT, where we had gone to school. And I think so. I'd say the first thing is just caring about it and really getting good at the craft of recruiting. But then I think it gets a little harder after the first 10 or 20 people, especially when you have to start hiring executives or people where you haven't done the job before. So like I grew up an engineer, studied engineering, very comfortable there, pretty comfortable interviewing engineers and evaluating technical talent. But when you're evaluating business people, all you can really tell is like, wow, this person's like knows a lot more than I do. They seem pretty good, and often. And so how do you deal with that? Especially if you don't even know what the job really is. We had a couple hacks that made that work for us. So one was actually just hiring consultants, like people who just to sort of tide us over till we had a need for a full-time person, or just to kind of plug the gap. And there's a lot of folks that will help. We had a sort of contract head of business development, contract head of marketing, contract head of recruiting, maybe a couple other things. That worked pretty well for us because then, you work closely with that person, you learn kind of enough of the job to know what you're talking about and how to evaluate people. So that's one. And then second, you lean on your investors. And if you have a great venture investor, as we had Sequoia Capital, who we had a great experience with, part of their job is to have a network and Rolodex of great execs. And so asking your investor, putting your investors to work, being like, hey, introduce me to the top 5 VPs of marketing in your portfolio, just so I know how to calibrate, and treat that nicely. Don't recruit the people that you're getting introduced to, or behave well. But I think you need to get a sense of like what does good really look like, because like if you hear someone playing guitar in a subway, you're like, wow, that person's has a Beatles song. Okay. Then you hear Jimi Hendrix, you're like, okay, like there's a lot of distance there, and so you just want to see, all right. And once you get a sense of like 5 or 10 people and calibrate, you get a sense of what good looks like. And so I think both of those things help de-risk those early exec hires. It's really
What's the
hard.
biggest hiring mistakes you made?
They're the kind of the classic mistakes, just like leaving people in role too long. The biggest mistakes that I've made are, I'd say, around that. They're leaving people in role too long, or not thinking critically about what do we really need, and or what is the role that we really need, and who is the person, and how do they fit, and like really being rigorous about that. So what that looks like is, I think for my own learning, it's like I'm like, I really need to keep my personal growth curve ahead of the company's growth curve. And that's a really hard thing to do. And you need your execs to do that too. Like what your exec needs to keep their learning curve or what they're providing ahead of of what the company needs. And if they start falling behind, it's often very difficult to catch up. And if they can't, then you need to move on them. So I think being too optimistic about people's ability to do that, or conflict avoidance, some of the stuff we talked about before, like not wanting to tell people hard, big things that will be difficult for them to hear. So withholding feedback and then creating an even bigger problem because now they're surprised by the feedback and things like that. So mostly in those kinds of categories. And I think, especially if you're a startup, you're all on a learning journey together, but your execs, you kind of need them to know what to do. And you still have to manage them. And there's a bunch of mistakes you can make around not or being too optimistic about them knowing what to do, which I can share more about. But I think the biggest category area for most people is leaving a struggling exec in place too long and not delivering feedback effectively.
You mentioned Sequoia there. I told you I did my work before the show. I spoke to Doug before the show, and he asked two questions. He said, ask him about the story of getting Sequoia invested and what you did to convince us. So I'm going to start on that. What did you do to convince Sequoia?
Well, we had as I said, our whole road into Y Combinator was kind of strange, and then we had a pretty unusual path after that too. So after Y Combinator culminates in demo day, where you basically, they fill up a room full of investors and a few companies. Obviously, it's a lot bigger now. There were maybe 10 companies in our batch. Now there's like 1,000 or something. But one of the first person who came, we did our demo at demo day. One of the people who came running up to us was a guy named Pejman, who's like actually came running up to her. I was giving the presentation, but he ran up to Arash and started speaking Farsi to him. And I'm like, what is going on? And Pejman's like, oh, you guys need to come down. Because we were living in Boston, but we were just in Mountain View visiting for demo day. And he's like, you got to come visit. And we're like, I don't know. We've almost kind of raised our first round, but sure. He's very persuasive. And he's like, okay, come to our office. Here's my business card. This day, so we get it scheduled.
Come have some tea.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. So yeah, we get down there, and we're like, we were renting another zip car, getting down there on University Ave in Palo Alto, and we're like running late, and I'm like, wait, what the hell is this Medallion Rug Gallery? I'm like, we're late, and we're not even at the right place, but I'm like, the number is what I think from the email, okay? So we go in there, we're like, hey, is Pejman here? And you look in the shop, it's just like people looking at rugs. And a receptionist just there looking at the people who are looking at rugs. And we're like, okay. And she's like, oh, Pejman, sure, yeah, come with me. And of course, Palo Alto, University Ave, the rug shop has a back room with a projector and a startup kind of pitch room, boardroom. And, and so, and Pejman was awesome. He was like a believer from the beginning. He's like, I want to introduce you all these people here, meet these people at Sequoia. And we're like, Sequoia for us is, we're like, well, we're not ready for that. It was just me and Arash at the time. We weren't planning to, we were a little intimidated by the prospect of getting like full venture capitalists involved yet. But we took the meeting. But Pejman made an introduction to Samir Gandhi, who's now at Excel, but he was at Sequoia at the time. We met on a Friday. Pejman actually came with us to our pitch, which I learned later is extremely unorthodox. And then Mike Moritz, kind of the godfather of Sequoia, came to our apartment on Saturday morning. We had a handshake deal on Monday, and then money in the bank a week after that. So like one business day turnaround, they move super fast. And it was wild. One of the biggest challenges in that process was like, they're like, okay, we want to invest in you. Great, figure out terms. And they were like, send us your wiring instructions. And we're like, wiring instructions? I'm like, all we have is like my first business checking account from like a Bank of America account we opened in the mall in Cambridge, literally. So we had to give you a sense of like what you have to do as an entrepreneur. Like, so we're like, okay, this is really embarrassing if like they're like, yes, we want to give you the money, and we can't figure out how to get the money from them into our bank account. So we went to the Bank of America like branch in North Beach, and we're like, sit down. We're like, there's like people in line for like the ATMs, and there's like the leather seat people. We're like, this is probably a leather seat thing. So we grab a seat. She's like, how can I help you? We hand our like debit card to her, and she's like pulling up the account. And I'm like, hey, is there a limit to how much this bank account can hold? And she's like, what do you mean? And she's like pulling up our thing, and we have $60 in our checking account, in our corporate checking account. I'm like, can it hold like $1 million? She's like, yeah. And I don't know what she thought we were like, great. And we got the numbers and everything and walked out. And we were like, yeah. And then fortunately it all worked. But wiring instructions, the only thing I knew about it was like James Bond movies or like that. And, but we were like, we probably don't want to screw up the getting the money in the bank part.
Do you remember the deal? How big was the round? What was the price?
Yeah, it was a 1.2 million on 3.8 pre, so 5 post.
Oh, that sounds great.
Yeah, it was great to us. I mean, back then that was a really good deal. And then I'd do it again. I think it was partnering with an investor who's like really, or I think there's a lot of different ways to fundraise. Party rounds are very popular, but then they kind of diffuse responsibility, or you end up with, you think you have a lot of people supporting you, but really no one's invested in your success. And I think a big difference between versus a venture VC, like if you have a great VC, couple things, like one is the partner actually career is on the line with your investment, so they have a lot of incentive to make it work well. And then if you pick a good investor that's seen great company, that's had a front row seat to great companies, so like Sequoia's funded Google and Apple and Yahoo and or Cisco, the list goes on and on. Then they help with the pattern recognition can actually help. I mean, there's challenges with VCs. They can you're there. They want their money back with many times their money back. So it's not a charity. You have to perform. But for us, that was a really great experience. And I think a big difference between my first and second company was having that kind of accountability, having the structure of board meetings, having some guidance, having someone having someone with us who could help us, help us steer and see around corners was really great.
Final question before we do a quick fire, and I have to admit it's another one from Doug. He asked, have you ever had the chance to sell the company? And if so, why didn't you?
Yeah. So we have at different points, especially early on. I think any company that's doing well, you get a lot of overtures from different folks. We got kind of kicked up the food chain to Steve. We had a meeting with Steve Jobs at Apple after a series of other meetings. How
did it go?
It was wild. It was he came in, he sat down, he's like, you guys have built a great product, like bucket list, like under the table. I'm like, hey, check. Steve said we have a great product. It's awesome. But I was also a little terrified because I talked to a lot of other founders, and the Steve stories kind of fell into one of two buckets, like either super charming, wonderful, or like the opposite, like total asshole Steve. And, we didn't know which one we were going to get. And so he kind of launches into this pitch. He's like, you guys should really throw in with us. We're like a startup with unlimited resources, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm like, oh, this is going to be awkward. But I'm like, Steve, like, we really love Apple, really admire everything you've done. But, we're really enjoying building this company. And, I think we have a long way to go. To do that, I'm sure you understand. But I thought he was going to start throwing stuff. And then he started, his mood shifted a lot. He was like, well, you guys are a feature, not a product. And now we're going to have to compete with you and kill you, and you don't have distribution and da-da-da-da-da. So it was very overt, and kind of intimidating. This is 2009. And then, but to his credit, the formal part of the meeting lasted maybe 10 or 15 minutes, but he stuck around for another 30, 40 minutes, just asking us about, our backgrounds. And I was asking him about why'd you come back to Apple, and why Cupertino, and all these different things. So it was great experience. That was the only time we really met. But for me, and I didn't even want to talk numbers, and mainly I just didn't want to piss him off. Mainly I wanted to leave that meeting with no action items. Because I didn't want to get him spun up that, oh man, that Apple should be more serious about this, or didn't want to piss him off and, lose a partnership opportunity or different things. The reason why we didn't want to sell because we just thought the company was just going to be doing better and better, and like maybe that would change, in which case we'd probably still have good options. But I think Arash and I were very focused on building for the long term, and we thought, as big shareholders, this was the best thing. To stay independent. But, I don't think it's a religious thing. I've had other experiences where, I let my test prep company, I had to let that go. So these are, I think these existential decisions really, I think that's why it's really important to get a sense of, be conscious about why am I doing this? What does winning look like for me? And being in touch with what is really motivating for me and what do I want to solve for with the company.
Drew, I want to move into a quick fire round. I love that on Good Steve, Bad Steve. But I say a short statement, you give me your immediate thoughts. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, great.
Is Dropbox a consumer or a B2B company?
So more a B2B company. Now, that said, we're applying the consumer playbook to business software. So if we had to choose one, we're helping people at work, although people do use Dropbox at home.
What's the hardest element of your role with Dropbox today?
I think going from, or the biggest journey we've been on is going from building building an innovative product to building a machine that builds innovative products. They are very different things. So driving that kind of transformation and then maturing the company to drive operational excellence has been really tough.
What have you recently changed your mind on?
I think the importance of that kind of structure and discipline. So as an Enneagram 7, you're comfortable with chaos, loosey-goosey. That does not scale. So having to model that myself to really be a lot more organized and disciplined and assertive and not conflict avoidant, so therefore being direct, I think that's been a thing I've had to change a lot.
Who's the best board member that you've worked with and why?
So I've got a lot of wonderful board members today. I don't want to pick favorites among them. I'd say in the past, so Condoleezza Rice was on our board for several years. And she was great. She's seen scale in all its forms. So she's on public company boards. She ran the State Department, which is an 85,000 person organization, very weighty, consequential decisions. And then also was provost at Stanford, where she had to manage a huge organization operationally there too. So just her insights on, what is it? What is the definition of a difficult problem, or how do you lead with principle? I learned a lot from her.
Penultimate one, biggest lesson from joining the Meta board?
It's been a lot of fun. I think first is just the scale, right? The numbers are so huge, the decisions are so consequential, and then also just a lot of the fundamental challenges are kind of unsolvable. They're part of the human condition, where how do we trade off between privacy and security and safety. And a lot of those things are what we deal with on a smaller scale too. And then I've learned a lot from Mark in terms of how to cut to what is essential and focus and move decisively and kind of be direct and assertive.
Final one, Dropbox in 5 years. Where will we be, Drew?
Well, I think where we're headed is shifting from Dropbox, from syncing your files to organizing all of your cloud content and stuff to organizing your whole working life. And so we're all using a ton of different tools. It's a very fragmented experience. Under the Zoom window here is just total mayhem, 100 tabs open. We think Dropbox can do a lot to help you with those kinds of problems. And then, so I'd say both with, in a world where we're now working out of screens instead of offices, there's a lot of room for that digital environment we're all in is really important. There's a lot of room for improvement. And then also the renaissance we're seeing in machine learning, where we're all kind of getting this silicon brain in addition to our human brains, and where I think we're finding that we're going to be able to split up the work or offload a lot of our busy work to machines. So I think the combination of pulling everything together and building a generation of smarter tools and a smarter system, those are things that I'm really focused on with Dropbox.
Drew, as I said at the beginning, I've wanted to make this happen since your episode with Tim in 2018. I can't thank you enough for joining me and for putting up with my wayward questions.
It's been great. Thanks, Harry.